about another round of applause for Sue real quick, everybody. Great leader. Glad to have her on our side. All right, so thank you, John, for the warm introduction. My name is Mike Miller, and I am with Elastic. I'd like to thank INSA for hosting this event. This is a much-needed event, and it's good to get the whole community together to talk about ideas like that. So Elastic is proud to support this program today. Elastic technology enables practical applications of AI ML, really giving analysts the power to extract real value and actionable insights out of your data. At petabyte scale, as Sue mentioned, with very fast performance. And we do offer the ability to do some cross-cluster sharing as well, which he touched on is very important. So cool technology. The number one thing I've heard since I started here about 6 months ago from customers is we have a ton of data, it's growing like crazy, it costs too much money, and we don't know what to do with it. We can really help make sense out of a lot of that. The machine learning capabilities that we have make insights and data intelligence more accessible to users and analysts while still providing the tools that the experts need to create those custom models. So our latest release, we have expanded deeper into the natural language processing, as Sue mentioned, with support for BERT and similar transformer models. And we are excited to see how the community uses those features. And we've been able to see some fantastic results so far, truly empowering analysts with world-class technology to do those hard and difficult problems like Sue mentioned. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Larry Hanauer, the moderator for our first panel called Gaining the AI Advantage, Strategic Approaches to Big Data. Larry is INSA's Vice President for Policy, where he develops much of the content for INSA events, policy councils, and government outreach. He's worked on defense and intelligence issues for more than 25 years, with service at INSA, the RAND Corporation, the House Intelligence Committee, Booz Allen, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So as Sue decreed earlier, prepare to be inspired. And I will now turn it over to Larry to start the conversation. And thanks for having me today.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm looking forward to inspiring you, I hope, during your panel. I don't want to take a lot. Stage, and you have, oh, that's better. Thank you for turning that mic on. I'm a New Yorker, so I usually like to think I can project, but it's much better with a microphone. So you know who's who on stage. You have the full agenda in front of you, but to my right, we have Ryan Carpenter, who is the program analyst for the AIM initiative, the Augmenting Intelligence with Machines initiative at ODNI. We have Lakshmi Raman, who's the chief of AI at CIA. We have Brian Mazanec, the Director of Strategic Warfare and Intelligence Defense Capabilities and Management at the Government Accountability Office. And then Kristen Cheman, the Vice President for Digital and Analytical Solutions at LMI. So we should get some great perspectives from different parts of the intelligence community, from a part of Congress, and some assessments of the Defense Department's capabilities, because GAO recently came out with a report on DOD's AI strategies and capabilities, and then some private sector perspectives. So we'll try to get all of those perspectives to bear on the questions of AI strategy and how we can take a strategic approach to big data. So let me just go right into some of the questions. So for everyone, one takeaway from Sue's keynote is that the IC really has to improve its ability to analyze and produce intelligence from its immense data holdings at scale. And to do this, agencies need AI and other advanced technologies, as well as a skilled tech workforce. So I want to explore the strategic approach that each of your organizations is taking to address each of these issues. So let's start with Ryan at ODNI. Sue said earlier the IC has underinvested in human-machine integration, but in 2018, ODNI issued a strategy for augmenting intelligence using machines that sought to leverage data and AI tools for analytic advantage. So how has the IC implemented that strategy? How has it evolved since 2018? And maybe how have we invested in human-machine integration?
Sure. Well, thanks, Larry. I'll leave the inspiration up to you.
Thanks.
So in 2018, when AIM was created and started, it was a pretty direct and simple directive they had. It was incentivize the community, organize the community around AI, and make sure that there are build a community that responds to each other and knows what each other's doing. And to that end, they were going to plant flowers across, if I can print an image here, basically planting a field in a way that there's AI across the community. And also, they knew the imperative and they knew the capability of AI, they just don't know how to employ it. So they tried to do it in an organized fashion. And to the most part, they were pretty successful. But the way that the IC has grown, the way that capabilities have grown and moved along, there needs to be a more integrated approach. If I may, the field has been planted, but it's now a disorganized field, and now we are trying to set up a way, make it a garden from a field. So to that end, we have organized AIM in 4 different buckets, if you will. The first is transforming tradecraft. That is, we know that artificial intelligence is going to change the way the IC does business and the way analysts look at things. The different intelligence officers across the IC, it's going to change. And so we are going to help those folks understand the implications of AI and looking at data in different ways. The second is lead the ethical and secure and responsible adoption of AI. And that is building those policies and building those structures that actually allow for people to understand what is going into that and also the conclusions that they draw from the data and what sort of conclusions they can draw from different models. And so we want to be in the front end of that. The third is actually developing the workforce for a transition to AI, meaning to understand these things, there's basic baseline things with practitioners, but also folks who manage AI and manage those workflows that create of those people, basically understanding how to manage folks who are in the tech. They don't even understand the tech. If I may steal from NSCAI, the commission that I was on, it's being literate. It's being AI literate. It's not everyone needs that. It's the baseline understanding across the IC, across the community. And the third is orchestrating integration. It's actually understanding what's out there in the community. It's understanding how we can organize ourselves in a way from the perspective of ODNI that is not discombobulated, that's actually focused, and we can actually start to build, if I can use a really poor phrase, synergy across the community in a way that actually makes sense. Because as these capabilities are being built in different agencies, they're not necessarily talking to each other. So ODNI takes that role to try to integrate across those different silos.
Great. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned a few things that we'll come back to later in the discussion, particularly ethical use of AI, workforce literacy, and the like. So we're going to hold those thoughts. But let's move on to Lakshmi for CIA. So of course, ODNI sort of sets the overarching strategy and the approach for AI. But what are the agency's goals for AI, and how do they align with the IC's AIM strategy?
Sure. So thanks to INSA for having me here. I really appreciate it. So at CIA, we strive to ensure that we are in alignment with the AIM program, and we're driving along with our DNI and IC partners in the adoption of tradecraft and technical capability that's enabled by AI. We know that the IC and the ODNI are working to really coordinate all of our AI activities, and we really want to work with them on kind of the integration of that resource sharing. We want to work with ODNI to help raise that awareness and understanding of the opportunities and challenges presented by emerging AI capabilities, and we want to work with them as the focal point in that space. There's been some successes over the past few years as we continue to work towards that overarching unified approach to AI capability development and integration. So at the CIA, the role that I hold, which is the Director of AI, is a new one, but that doesn't mean that CIA is new to the AI game, right? We've had some successes over the years. As a matter of fact, in a prior position I held as the head of enterprise data science, we had a lot of AI projects underway. This new role, the Director of AI, was created so that we could really have a single focal point at the agency to kind of further develop that AI agenda across all of our directorates and all of our mission centers. So the first thing I'm really kind of tasked to do is what you talked about, Larry, is to create and update that AI strategy. Mm-hmm. And so just to get down to it, what are our goals, right? What are the goals of the CIA's AI strategy? So we're really working towards a whole of agency approach towards AI, right? We want to go across collection, analysis, operational operations, digital innovation, S&T, acquisition, legal, finance, right? We want everybody to feel a part of this strategy. And there's basically 3 pillars, right, that we're driving towards that I can mention. Number 1 is AI as an intel topic, right? We want to see AI as a critical topic that we need to treat as something that needs attention in and of itself, right? So that we can collect, track, and analyze the work of our nation's adversaries in that area. Number 2 is AI as a mission enabler, right? What are we doing to drive our resources and all of our capabilities to augment our human judgment, right? To automate our workflows, right? How are we thinking about, and I think Sue Gordon said it, right? She talked about like the adjacents, right? How are we thinking about what are we doing for our foundations? What are we doing for our workforce to kind of drive the AI use and adoption that we need? Okay, and then the third one is progress and impact, right? What are we really doing in terms of putting in governance? What are we really doing to put in, to understand the metrics and reporting, right? So that we can really assess progress against those first 2 pillars. So what's the process through which we govern the adoption of AI tools and capabilities? And then what's that rigorous process for evaluation?
So one thing that is really interesting is your comment that you're meant to be a sort of a focal point for a whole of agency approach to AI. So Brian, one of the things the GAO looked at as it assessed DOD's AI structures and governance infrastructure and capabilities is this notion of a whole of department capability and whether and to what extent that exists. So, so your report really focused on the resources, the capabilities, and the plans for AI technologies. And one thing that struck me was that you're finding that the department lacked a high-level roadmap for its requirements and activities, which suggests maybe there isn't that whole of department focal point. So what were your principal findings, and how did you assess the Pentagon's ability to apply these AI tools and technologies and capabilities?
Yeah, thanks Larry, and thanks to INSA for the opportunity to be here today. So again, just to make sure it's crystal clear, I'm with the Government Accountability Office, legislative branch, so I'll be talking a lot about DOD. We looked at DOD, but I'm not speaking, of course, on their behalf. But before I get right to your question, Larry, and dive into the inventory piece and some of our other findings in our recent report, I thought maybe just very briefly to back up and frame the story for the Department of Defense a little bit, at least how we approached it. So first of all, AI, and we're talking about it as a very new thing, in many respects it is, but it's not really new for DOD. They've had activity since the 1950s focused on AI. In 1981, the Navy stood up a Center for Advanced Research for Applied Applications on AI. So there's been a lot of activity in the department on this topic for a long time. It really picked up speed in 2017 with the stand-up of the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, commonly known as Project Maven, under USDINS. The next year, they stood up to the focal point question, the Joint AI Center, or the JAIC. And then just this year, actually just a few weeks ago, they hit initial operating capability for the Office of the Chief Digital and AI Officer, which is going to be the successor organization for the JAIC, as well as subsuming some other functions that we'll talk about. So there's been a lot of acceleration to the consolidation point within the department. I'll get to our observations in a moment. GAO has also kind of leaned into this space a little bit. In June of last year, we put out a AI accountability framework, which is intended to be a tool. It's actually the tool we use then in our report that I'll get into momentarily, that we issued a public version of just a few weeks ago. But it's intended to be really a resource for our colleagues across government, and even in the private sector, you may want to look at it as just a set of best practices, principles on data governance, on strategic management of AI issues. So I would definitely encourage my colleagues on the panel, as they work on updating the AIM strategy, the CIA strategy, to consult with that. It's I think, a useful resource. But in our most recent report, to get to the specific question, we did focus on 3 different areas that were sort of our main thrusts and findings. The first was on the DOD strategy for AI. And we'll get into that a little bit more later, but we used that accountability framework. We saw a lot of good things, but we also saw some room for improvement with the 2018 DOD AI strategy and sort of the constellation of nested strategies under it. We also looked at AI collaboration across the department, how the JAIC was serving as that focal point And again, I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more. And then the third one, to Larry's question, was on the AI inventory. So there's a legislative requirement that the department develop a comprehensive inventory of AI activities and programs for obvious reasons, to be able to deconflict, avoid duplication, achieve synergies where possible. We looked at that, and the first sort of baseline report that they put out was in April of last year. And we found some, and others have looked at this as well, including the DOD Inspector General. We found some significant gaps in what they put together. And some of that is understandable because AI is not, it's sort of a standalone thing. It's a capability embedded in other systems. Also, the department, while they now have in the 2018 AI strategy a common definition of AI, sort of operationalizing that is really hard. We surveyed roughly 40 components across the department and found that they all had different operationalization or sort of application of that definition. So that makes developing an inventory difficult. The big other deficiencies we found was that they did not look at, in their inventory from last year, any classified programs. It was a purely, which if you think about Project Maven, kind of geo, where some of the nascent applications are of AI, it really is more in that IC classified arena. So that's a huge limitation in our view, as well as the fact that they did not include any O&M. So they were really focused more on the acquisition side of AI. So it was incomplete. They're developing a new process to do this. They actually should be any day now, if it hasn't already happened, a new version of the inventory. They're going to do it annually. That should be improved. We'll be eager to look at that. And they have an agile acquisition effort to sort of build that out so they can improve over time how they do this. We had a few recommendations in that area, but this will be a key, I think, area for the department to develop a really robust inventory going forward.
Great. So industry, of course, plays a critical role in the development of AI tools and applications that all of these agencies use. So Kristen, how do private sector technologists and analysts look at the issue, and what industry best practices can all these government agencies adopt?
Thanks for the question, and thank you too for having me. I think in order to make sense of massive amounts of data, you need to first be able to find it in the first place, and then once you know where it is, be able to access it, be able to use it, and then trust that the data that you're using is of the right quality for whatever the purpose is. And that spectrum involves a holistic enterprise data strategy, and that has a lot of pieces and parts to it. It's everything from data architecture to data storage, data governance, data security, metadata management, data quality. It's a whole lot to think about. It's hard to know where to start, and there's really no one tool that can fix all of those problems at once. And so some potential best practices as you're thinking about all of that and how best to make sense of a lot of data is first, maybe from an organizational standpoint, what cultural barriers stand in the way of sharing data? And we'd never not share data with each other, right? The second is, from a technology perspective, what can you accomplish with your current tech stack and data? You know, rather than tearing everything out and starting from scratch, what can you do with what you have? And then lastly, how might we achieve multiple of Sue's easy importance at once? And so, for example, if I start with metadata management, how can I use a metadata management tool to also achieve governance workflows and to uncover data quality issues and to encourage fixing some of those data quality issues? So how can we get as much momentum and speed as possible?
Great. So it's interesting you started out by saying that the critical first step is finding and figuring out how to use trusted data. So I want to get at the issue of this shared data. So a core principle of the IC's integration and information sharing efforts is that data is an IC asset, or a shared asset. So to make effective use of that shared data across agencies and across DOD as well, it makes sense to ensure a common foundation of shared tools and technologies and methodologies and standards. So how do the Defense Department, individual IC agencies, and companies all synchronize their strategic approaches to big data challenges so that everyone's on the same sheet of music? Brian, let's
Well,
start with you.
first I'd say that IC activities, AI IC activities are not enough. There's a foundation that needs to be built, and just speaking from the perspective of DNI, there's just this, if you have a secure AI ecosystem that's infrastructure that binds these together is really the starting point, because what individual agency is incentivized to share? There really is an incentive to do that. So from the role of DNI, it's getting those foundational principles in place and those standards and those policies that they can actually access those things. Look, everyone has busy days, and they're focused on mission, and we rightly should be. But there's these overarching, to use the quad chart, there's the hard important things that are necessary here, and for some folks it's the boring part, not for this audience, but if you're in the IC, the mission is just going to drive all these things. But it's also these foundational issues that need to be driven and then socialize those things. It's a matter of awareness for across the IC and our business partners. So it's really that it's communicating, it's organizing. I go back to our goal of orchestrated integration. It's communicating those things to partners. It's getting out in front of those things and actually helping point to that vision that we're trying to achieve.
All right, so Lakshmi, so ODNI sets those foundational standards. What happens when they get to the agency?
So I think once it gets to the agency, right, we have to think about how do we align to the standards that ODNI has set. And when I think about, I think the question was how do DOD, IC, and our individual agencies synchronize their strategic approach, right? So when I think about what DOD has in their published strategy around data, I think there's areas where there are elements that are common to CIA, right? There's things like in their published strategy, it says DOD data will be visible, right? It'll be accessible, it'll be understandable, it'll be linked, right? So consumers can exploit complementary data elements. It says it'll be trustworthy, interoperable, secure, right? Those are all things that are also important to CIA and the IC writ large. So I think that these goals make data accessible across a community of users, right? And CIA is actually in the process of updating our agency data strategy, so it'll be really, stay tuned on that alignment.
Okay. Look forward to that.
Yeah.
So Brian, at DOD, the department has its own challenges in sharing data across the department. So how does DOD approach this issue of shared data as a resource?
Yeah, DOD is obviously huge, so this is really a wicked problem for them. And as was mentioned, they do have a good overarching framework and strategy for data governance, but what we really looked at in our most recent report, we kind of dug a little bit deeper into how that's operating at an operational level. The JAIC has created something called the Joint Common Foundation, or JCF, and that's really intended to be beyond just the governance and strategy. That's intended to be they call it sort of the AI sandbox, where it's an actual tool where you can share data, you can share algorithms, you can jointly collaborate on new applications based on other tools that others have built in this space. So it's a really promising thing, very important. We found some significant challenges and limitations that the JAIC is having as they build that JCF. One of which is, and this is sort of consistent with as we looked at the inventory question too, which is separate from the JCF. Right now, at least at the time as we were completing our report, it was only in the unclassified realm. They were still working to move it to the various high-side domains, which is again really important if you want to collaborate with CIA and others on some of these things. We also found that a lot of components weren't really using or focused on the JCF. As I mentioned, we did this survey of components and we found only 12 were really, I viewed the JCF as sort of a key tool to share data, to share algorithms going forward. So we had some recommendations, and it's also an agile software acquisition effort, the JCF. So we had some suggestions for how they can really come up with more robust milestones to sort of complete that program, address these gaps, because it is really critical. We did hear too, as we met with other components, that they're and when we met with General Groen at the JAIC, that there's some concern that there's going to be sort of a constellation of JCFs where there's going to be each service building their own and they'll maybe be connected, but that could be much more difficult than just getting everyone into the same AI sandbox, so to speak. So really important challenge for them.
All right, so Kristen, in industry, you're supporting a wide range of government clients and maybe other commercial clients as well. So how does a private company deal with AI standards and frameworks, internally and for its part?
I'll start small and then go bigger in terms of data sharing within an organization and then externally as it relates to AI. Tying back to the first question and my answer there, I think the first thing organizations can do as they tackle this problem is get over sort of the cultural barriers and hurdles. The second thing is to think beyond managing and sharing structured data. So think about your unstructured data assets as well. This is images and drawings, news articles, resumes. Those sources of information are super important to things like object detection and natural language processing and other really powerful AI techniques. And they ought to be managed and shared right alongside structured data. And the challenge that I'd throw out to your organization, whether it's a public one or a private one, is think about what data you're not collecting today, and perhaps that's a pivot point for sharing with other organizations. So rather than starting from scratch and collecting data that you don't have but need, perhaps that's a collaboration opportunity.
Can I just pull on a thread there? Because you mentioned looking at resumes and things like that. We're focused so much on using AI to understand our adversaries' capabilities or to make our targeting more effective or all these sort of core national security missions. But there's also an opportunity to use AI tools for all kinds of support functions, like looking through resumes or planning military logistics or other things that are maybe less sexy, but equally as important to the functioning of an organization. So what are opportunities to apply those tools, let's say, for the human resources function or other things in a company?
Yeah, sure. I can give a specific example of a technology that we've been developing within my organization. Perhaps our most important asset to national security is our people and our workforce, and we'll talk more about that. But we've been developing a capability called employee value proposition, and that is really the application of a recommendation engine, an AI technique that looks across our workforce and really makes matches to people and capabilities within the organization. So for example, it might recommend for me a certification that I should take based on certifications that my peers are pursuing, or it might recommend a mentor for me within the organization. And we found that capability goes a long way in terms of retention and maintaining that super important asset, which is our people.
Yeah. And for others, are your organizations also looking at AI for those sorts of support functions, or not the core analytic functions? For DOD, for example, I think it must be.
Yeah, so within DOD, absolutely, as we looked at actual use cases where AI was being employed right now in the department. I mentioned Project Maven, some of the IC-related classified applications in the analytic services for remote sensing data or human language technology, but we saw actually a lot in the, I think, more mundane sort of business operations space where they were using tools. For example, the Jake developed one AI tool they called Game Changer, a bit of maybe an oversell of what it was, but it was essentially a policy scanning tool that they used to go through all of the huge volume of governance documents within the department and actually help them as they tried to develop a strategy to sort of improve AI governance. Yeah. But it was driven by AI algorithms.
Others?
Sure. I think our support mechanisms are an area ripe for AI, because we talk about that automation of workflows, right? There's, and the example I always like to give is, like, for example, the processing of a voucher, right? Where you're going to get reimbursed for something. Like, it's a very kind of rote process often. So, right. Approve. So I think that there are areas within our support organization that are just ripe for automation by AI.
One little thing to add. Yeah. I think that organizations reflect your values, and I think the creation of the IC CDO a while ago was actually a huge step forward, because if that's someone who actually owns that particular issue, And by organizing around that issue and actually saying who's going to own that, I think it really shows people like this is going to be how we're going to organize, and this is what we see as an asset is data. And they've been a huge partner for us because by ourselves we can't do this, but with the CDO and CIO, I think that's been a game changer in terms of actually coordinating and making sure that we're included on things and make sure that we include them on certain things. So it's just actually organizing institutions is critical here.
It reminds me of that old saying, what is it, for want of a nail, the kingdom was lost, right? That without the nail, you couldn't put the horseshoe on, so the horse couldn't ride, so the horse couldn't go into battle, and you lost the battle and the kingdom was
like where
lost.
this is
So
going.
if you can't pay that voucher in a timely fashion, then you can't get that source, which means you can't get that intelligence, which means you don't get that great insight. So even using AI for these sort of more routine business functions, I think is pretty critical.
Right, and freeing up our human resources for those higher order
value
tasks, right?
Tasks, exactly. Let me ask a question about cloud computing, because Brian, you mentioned the joint common foundation that DoD uses. But it seems like having an enterprise cloud environment is critical for making effective use of data. So Lakshmi, let me start with you and ask about how the agency uses cloud computing to improve data access and use across the organization. And then Brian, if you have anything else you want to add about the joint common foundation, jump in with that.
Sure, so CIA has partnerships with many of the large cloud computing infrastructure platforms. In November 2020, the CIA awarded the C2E contract, the Commercial Cloud Enterprise contract, to Amazon, Google, IBM, Microsoft, and Oracle, and they will all be competing for task orders under the cloud service provider portion of the contract to provide products such as infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and many other professional services. So the CIA has access to leading commercial providers of AI ML services among these technologies, and they offer that backbone for our officers to develop and deploy their own AI and data analytic tools when necessary. I think those managed services, those available via some of those available via some of those cloud providers are going to be key to some of how we apply AI to some of our highest priority mission problems.
Yep. Yeah. Brian, anything else on the joint common foundation?
Just brief, so I won't wade into the DoD cloud contractual environment, although I do think it has had an effect in somewhat delaying the development of the JCF because it's going to reside and run in those environments. But again, just to foot stomp what I mentioned earlier, the JCF really is, I think, a key part of the future of AI collaboration within DoD. And when we looked at their plan to really address the gaps we saw in the current iteration of the JCF, they really do need to develop a milestone, measures to monitor progress, those kind of things that GAO typically looks for. They were developing, we heard, a roadmap or kind of high-level document intended to get at those efforts, but those were supposed to come out, I think, last August and have been continuously delayed. Some of that might now be with the other organizational changes going on around AI in the department. They may be waiting, but the JCF, again, will be really critical for DoD.
Okay, thanks. Just as we go through the questions, I want to remind everyone we do want to hear from you. So if you do have questions to pose to the panelists, please write them down on the index cards on your table. Some of our staff members will come around the room and collect them, and we'll get those posed to us in a few minutes. So Brian, I also want to get at something that the GAO report looked at, and that's the establishment of DoD's Chief Digital and AI Office. So in the memo establishing that office, Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks wrote that the office will be responsible for strengthening and integrating data, AI, and digital solutions in the department. So given what GAO found about the shortcomings in department-wide collaboration and integration, how will this new office help DoD apply AI at an enterprise scale?
Yeah, great question, Larry. I think it's probably to be determined whether or not the CDAO, how the CDAO will play out and if it will be effective. This was in part what was attempted in 2018 with the stand-up of the JAIC. The JAIC was intended to be this focal point, but it ended up, at least in our work and kind of observations, to be more of sort of a coalition of the willing. So I think the hope now is this is the further growth. You've got the JAIC as part of the CDAO as well as the Defense Digital Service and the Chief Data Officer, so they're pulling a little bit more into it. I think it's a positive sign that the Deputy Secretary Hicks really has taken a direct role, and that leadership focus will be helpful. But we're going to be eagerly watching to see how it comes together. It's supposed to, so it hit IOC on February 1st. It's supposed to achieve FOC, I believe, in June. So we'll be eager to see what that looks like.
So we'll see what happens.
Yep.
when
And it's a great point too from a geo perspective. We've made a number of these recommendations in our recent report in these different areas on collaboration strategies. So having this organizational stand-up is a perfect pivot point for the department to really implement and address the gaps that we identified.
Now, so much of the so much of the AI capabilities that the government uses are developed by industry, and of course we have a lot of industry people in the audience today. So I want to talk a little bit about public-private collaboration and how that works on these issues. So let's start with Lakshmi, with you at CIA. How does the agency stay abreast of the range of innovative technologies that industry is developing in the commercial sector? And when you find an interesting technology, how do you work with the developers who may not have experience working in the government contracting environment to bring their technology into the agency?
Sure. So CIA has multiple avenues to stay abreast of innovative technologies and processes with respect to AI. I think the one people here are probably most familiar with is In-Q-Tel, right? In-Q-Tel is a private, independent, nonprofit kind of strategic investor that supports the IC and helps us gain access to emerging technologies. And so it kind of was founded when the CIA thought maybe, and other government agencies thought we were missing out on some of those cutting edge, innovative, and impactful technologies coming out of Silicon Valley. So the idea with In-Q-Tel was to combine our security savviness within the government with the can-do curiosity of Silicon Valley. And as technology evolved, right, the government needs transformed. We used In-Q-Tel to kind of establish new initiatives within our spaces, right, and to figure out how to apply some of those commercial technologies against our highest priority problems. We also partner, in other spaces, right? We partner with academia. We partner with national labs. We have lots of independent partnerships, right, with commercial industry so that we can acquire innovative technologies. But we also now have a group called Digital Futures. Right, Digital Futures' role is to accelerate the identification and adoption of industry-leading technologies and processes to solve mission problems. And also, I will say that we have a robust cadre of data scientists, computer scientists, data engineers that also stay on top of their respective fields, right? So we leverage them to be on top of what's going on commercially and inform us as to what to bring in.
Right. All right, so Brian, Lakshmi mentioned In-Q-Tel and Digital Futures as resources for the IC. DOD certainly has its own technology accelerators, DIU and AFWorks and things like that. So based on GIO's research, how effectively do the myriad DOD components bring advanced AI and data analytics capabilities into the department?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And I don't know if anyone's read Amy Ziegart's new book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, but I like how she refers to this as the suit-hoodie divide in terms of navigating to reach out to Silicon Valley and to industry in general, and the private sector. So I would say in terms of our recent AI-specific work, we didn't get directly at this question, although we do think having a good strategy, having a good those things will drive and enable better collaboration with the private sector. But we have looked more broadly at this question within DOD beyond just the AI space, and I think our view is definitely, which I'm sure others in the panel would agree with, that it's a competitive advantage of the US to be able to leverage private sector innovation here. There are a lot of avenues within the department to do things like study contracts. So we recently, and currently are looking at space remote imaging and capabilities, and we've seen there's a lot of innovation, emerging capabilities in the space sector that's moving really fast. Study contracts, NRO has broad agency announcements. The challenge is then scaling those. So once you pilot a capability, how do you then cross that valley of death, as everyone talks about, to really make it an operational capability for the department? There's really cumbersome requirements process within DOD, with JSIDs, within the IC, with the IC capabilities requirements process. Just in that commercial space example, it was almost a 5-year process to develop the commercial requirements for remote sensing imagery. So that's not fast enough to keep pace with a rapidly evolving private sector. So we think there's a lot that can be done there. I would also mention, and I know Sue in her remarks said she wouldn't discuss the need for personnel security clearance reform, but that's an area on GAO's high risk list that I think is important, and it does come into play on this issue, both in terms of having a more timely process, especially for smaller companies, to get their personnel vetted, or deal with reciprocity and transfer of trust, and then also from SCIF space utilization, having an ability to get the secure spaces you need to be able to compete if you're a smaller company. So those are areas that I think are really important here too.
So Kristen, from the private sector side of the equation, what are some of the ways that industry connects with government to help to develop and showcase data analytics technologies? So what do you do as you're doing your outreach?
I think there's this interesting phenomena going on where on one hand you have government organizations where their digital IQ is increasing every day. I think Sue kindly acknowledged that all of us keep getting smarter. On the other hand, you have easier access to technology, and I mean that in two ways. So first of all, technologies are being procured, so you already have them on hand and ready to use. And more technologies are becoming low code, meaning you don't have to be a software developer to use them. So as that gap closes, I see government relying on industry more to come to the table with solutions rather than technical and advisory support. So for us, about 3 years ago, we stood up a rapid prototyping shop within our organization. And we lean on that organization to quickly identify government and customer pain points, to rapidly develop proofs of concept and prototypes. So rather than throwing ideas down on a PowerPoint slide, we're actually building a thing that we can then put in front of a customer to iterate around. And I think that kind of capability is super important and valuable, especially within the IC, where these R&D type efforts are hard to do on classified systems on the inside. And so I see customers are able to use this capability to, sort of suss out and develop focus and scope around what they want to be able to do and what they can do in sort of a rapid and unclassified setting. And so to answer your question, I think that our government customers are relying on industry members to provide the space and the resources to very quickly prove out ideas. And it's a bonus if those industry partners have good awareness of contracts and security requirements.
Right. So I want to get to an issue that's important sort of whenever we talk about the use of data, but I think it's particularly important in the defense and intelligence communities, and that's the ethical use of data. So as organizations collect and analyze massive amounts of data from different sources, they have an obligation to apply it in an ethical way. Now in commercial companies, data ethics principles generally focus on establishing clear rules for collecting, using, storing data, ensuring the data is accurate and unbiased, and that analyzing data is done in a transparent, explainable way, and then of course protecting privacy, individuals' privacy. So how do we deal with that in the defense and in the intelligence communities? Ryan, how does the IC apply ethical considerations to data across the community?
Sure, thanks Larry. So actually DNI handled this in the 2 documents that were released last year. There's the AI principles and the AI ethics framework. And actually you can find both of those on the DNI website, actually homepage. So I'll just take the principles. There really are just the things that outlined in there are the things that you consider when you are building any algorithm, doing anything with the AI. And the first was respect law and act with integrity, sort of like again, institutions reflect our values. That's like foundational to who we are and also how we handle data. The second is to be transparent and accountable. Just like, can you explain what happened? Like, it's not this black box. It's like, what happened, how the data was processed. To be objective and equitable. Tradecraft is the holy grail of the IC, and removing bias is one of the main tenets. And in removing bias from those algorithms and how you actually train these models is crucial to how we actually interpret these things. In particular, just, not just getting to a bad decision faster. It's actually trying to understand the biases implicit in those different models and how you're using AI. To be human-centered, We need to develop those to actually understand where the human components are and how to use it to be secure and resilient, and also to engage the community. We don't do this alone. We can't do this alone. We won't be effective if we do this alone. So engaging commercial partners and academe in a way that's meaningful and informs what we do is only to the betterment of us and to them communicating back and forth.
So Lakshmi, at an agency level, how does the agency deal with ethical data use questions?
Right, so I think there's really two big things we have to think about when we think about AI ethics. Number one is we need to be adhering to our democratic norms, right? That's really important. Number two is by doing this, it helps us ensure that we are getting expected outcomes, right, out of our models, right? If we're trading things in an ethical way, right, we're getting the answers that we expect to get. Ryan mentioned, right, the IC AI ethics framework. The CIA was a key contributor to that and has adopted it. I think what you described happening in the commercial sector isn't dissimilar to what's happening, right, that we think about within the intelligence community. And we share those same ethical concerns, right, for AI. And we think it should have, we adhere to that framework, and what that framework says is that, hey, AI should be used to achieve a defined purpose, right, after we look at the risks. It needs to be used in a lawful manner. It needs to adhere to policy. It needs to incorporate human judgment, and we need to see accountability, right, across the life cycle. It needs to pass testing at a level commensurate with risk. It needs to be documented, it needs to be explainable, and it needs to be reviewed periodically, right? We need to ensure that we're monitoring what we are doing. And then we also need to identify who is accountable and responsible for maintaining those records across the life cycle. So, we have adopted that framework, and we're going to be setting up governance that makes sure that we are adhering to that framework. Okay. So it's really important to what we do at the CIA.
And Brian, from GAO studies, does DOD have the same kind of governance framework with the same kind of principles?
Yeah, this is, I think, a good news story for the department, and consistent with what my colleagues here just mentioned. I think the department has also promulgated similar guidance in 2020, the AI ethical principles that DOD adopted, which I think largely mirror these same principles across government. In May of last year, Deputy Secretary Hicks released a memo on implementing responsible AI that has a number of actions in terms of developing implementation plan and strategy. At the time of our report, those were delayed past their targeted timeframes, but again, that may be related to the stand-up of the CDAO. And as I mentioned, we assessed a number of AI strategies at the component level and department-wide, and we saw in all of them really a heavy focus on this issue. So it's definitely, I think, something that they are appropriately focused on. I would note, I think for DOD, there might be two flavors of sort of ethical considerations. There's these issues of responsible use, privacy, traceability, reliability that we've been talking about here, but there's also, I think, some other different questions when you talk about maybe AI-enabled lethal autonomous weapon systems, the laws of armed conflict, how that applies. That may be a unique ethical challenge for DOD to navigate that maybe some of the other US government entities don't have to.
Right. Kristen, as a company, does LMI have the same kind of principles that these government agencies have for its governance of sort of the ethical use of AI?
Yeah, I was glad to hear that you framed the initial question around the ethical use of data, because I think it's really easy with all of the buzz around AI and the sense of urgency that I think we all feel to jump right into model development without thinking about the data itself, or without thinking about what the heck are we going to do with this model in a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. What happens when we have 20 models running in production, and how do we know when they're not working the way that they're supposed to, or when they're introducing bias? We've been leveraging technologies to help solve this problem, everything from software to manage data governance and access control down to the cellular level. And then we're also thinking about the long game, so looking at platforms that will help with model monitoring, that will help with auditing and logging models so that you can look back and see what exactly were the parameters around my model that I used to make a decision 3 years ago, and explainability for models that we're using, especially when they're being used to make decisions about people.
So I want to get to a couple of audience questions, and then I'll try to save a couple of minutes at the end for us to touch on some workforce issues, because I know those are important to everyone. So since we're talking about the ethical use of data and AI and governance, we have a question related to that. It says governance always lags. So how should we frame governance implementation so it's responsive to real-world AI and ML efforts? So we've been talking about how these governance structures are set up ahead of time, or at least contemporaneously with the use of the data, but do you feel like the governance is lagging, that the technology and the data use is getting ahead of the structures put in place to use it effectively and responsibly?
Well, I'll start.
ODNI is governance, so we'll start with you.
So here we go. Governance. So I would say, in terms of, because maybe IC-wide I would say lagging, but I don't want to get ahead of my skis here, because whenever you have this capability that's evolving this quickly, it's those tenets, those main tenets that you need to have in place as you go along, so you can build off of that as you build capability. So to say lagging, I would push back a little bit on that one and just say there are principles out there in the way that we coordinate the community that people are aware of. I would maybe say, maybe we're lagging towards codifying it. The discussions are being had, working groups are being had, where people are discussing these sorts of things. And maybe it's actually the codifying it where maybe the nuances, but as far as the pillars are concerned, they are there, and there's sort of this harmonizing function across the community. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. No, please.
Okay. So I would push back too a little bit. I think there has been, and we've mentioned a number, I mean, I've mentioned some of the DOD strategies, there's others, governance, there's a lot of focus on this issue. So I'm not sure it's lagging. Where I would say though that I think from a DOD perspective, at least in the work we did there, where there may be further challenges is just the inherent difficulty in really tangibly defining what even is an AI, sort of drawing the box when we're talking about anything, when there's not an agreement about what AI is or what it means in certain contexts. Even if you have the best principles and governance framework, it's not really going to be consistently useful. So that's an area, and that's just a difficult thing all around. There's no silver bullet, but the department's grappling with it.
Right, and I think we at the CIA have placed importance on it by making it one of our strategic pillars, right? We think it's really important to have this process to govern the adoption of AI tools and capabilities and to evaluate them. So I think the importance is reflected in that.
Kristen?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement. I wouldn't say that it's lagging, but I do think it requires a bit of intentionality.
Yeah.
So in the same way that we use DevSecOps practices to integrate security into the software that we're developing from the get-go, I think you need to think mindfully about doing the same thing here along the way.
That makes sense. So here's a question that gets to Brian's comment about sort of defining AI and asking what AI is. The question is, AI is a fairly broad term, and everyone is saying that they have it or use it. So how have you approached the vision, as Sue Gordon put it, that drives the need? In other words, how do you choose why or when to use AI?
What?
Oh, go ahead. You go, and then I'll go.
All right, sounds good.
See, there's collaboration between the intelligence community and the defense
branches of
department.
government.
Yes.
And Congress, no less.
I would just note, so the analogy I like, and I'm sure many here have heard it, but it's an AI, sort of equating AI to like electricity. It's a novel thing now, we're talking about it, but it's going to become ubiquitous and touch almost everything. So I'm not sure it's going to be a decision point, Larry, that should we or should we not use AI here? It's going to be everywhere. That was what I wanted.
No, and I 100% agree with Brian. I was going to use that exact same analogy about electricity, but I think what's also really important is that partnership that exists between the practitioner and the business, right? Mm-hmm. I think that partnership is key in deciding when and how to apply AI, not just in helping the practitioner understand where the actual problem is, having the business partner explain what the problem is and where that meeting in the middle happens, and also in engendering that trust in the solution.
All right, one question and then one more audience question, and then we'll close with some workforce comments. So this question is for Lakshmi. As you lead the agency's AI strategy, how do you think about the role of commercial data as opposed to classified data or OSINT in that strategy?
Yes, so I think there's a role to be played for commercial data, right? I think I partner heavily with our agency chief data officer to understand, as well as our various mission partners to understand where the commercial data can correlate appropriately with in our classified space. Mm-hmm. I think we think a lot about where we do some of our work on that commercial data, whether it's on the low side or the high side, when we bring that up, right? So I think to correlate it with our more classified data, I think we also think, and when we integrate it into what might be some of our more, I guess I would call it more exquisite classified solutions, right, that we can't discuss too much here, but I think there's definitely a place.
Great. All right, so we've talked a little bit over the course of the last hour or so about workforce and workforce literacy. So to make effective use of all this data and all these AI tools, we need a workforce that's not only highly skilled in some places, in data science and other skills, but we need non-experts and managers to at least be literate, as someone said, so that they know how to approach the data challenges and how to manage these data-driven activities. So Kristen, at LMI, how does the company approach the challenge of ensuring technical literacy across the workforce as needed?
Yeah, we have been rolling out digital enablement training for every single employee within our organization. And the training recognizes that not every person needs the same level of technical depth around digital competency. So we've organized our training around different personas based on whatever their role or their job is. So you have functional SMEs, whether that be in the intelligence space or SMEs in human resources or finance, who are learning the fundamentals around what is the cloud and what are the best uses for AI. And the intent there is so that all of us have a common vocabulary where we can communicate with each other around digital capabilities. We have digital hunters who are charged with finding new opportunities for applying IT and analytics and automation. And then we have training geared towards our digital architects and builders. These are the coders and the analysts who we need to be leaning forward, looking ahead at the next technologies and techniques. We've also partnered with government organizations to educate all levels of their organization, whether they be data scientists, non-data scientists, or senior leaders. And often, whether it's educating our own workforce or a government partner, we teach these courses on real problems with real data so that the concepts themselves are a little easier to understand and digest, and so that that student walks away with real results that they can take back to their part of the organization to actually implement.
Great. So we've just got about a minute left. So Lakshmi and then Ryan, why don't we talk about how the agency and the IC as a whole are working to ensure IC skills in the right places and literacy as needed?
Sure. So I would say at the agency we're taking kind of our digital acumen of our practitioners and our general workforce very seriously, right? So we want to ensure that our general workforce has the AI acumen to trust these solutions that our practitioners are giving them, to be able to partner with them, to really help identify places where AI can make a difference, and then to also trust those solutions, right? So it's really important that they understand what AI is, how it works, so that they can be a part of the solution. And our workforce's digital acumen and AI literacy are being improved through offerings of our AI Learning Center, right? It's a one-stop shop for providing training in support of our workforce's AI learning needs. They're doing a great job. We see new offerings all the time. I don't know if this is appropriate, but a shout out for our head of our AI Learning Center who's in the audience. But yeah, so we take it really seriously.
And just briefly, Ryan, across the IC, what's being done?
It's hard to overstate the importance of people who are AI literate. The one thing I say is baselining across the AI, actual jobs, roles, and titles, and what educational requirements are necessary for that, because a data scientist over here is a data engineer over here, actually getting a nomenclature and a lexicon across the IC is crucial here.
Yeah, that's important.
And Larry, if I can just make a quick
Please.
plug too, just to note the last NDAA that passed has a provision requiring GAO to look at DOD's AI workforce, so stay tuned, we'll have a report in 9 months or so on that topic.
All right, so we'll have you back next year when we're doing AI 2 and go into where we are then. So great, so hopefully you've all gotten a little bit of insight into the black box of how AI is used and applied across the Defense Department and the intelligence community and the private sector. So thank you to all the panelists for your insights, and please join me in a round of applause for our speakers.
Larry, thank you for, and panelists, thank you for this discussion. We're on break now. I know you've been waiting for break. 15 minutes, and we'll come back for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Take a quick picture.